Thanks, Rachel. Hello. Goedemorgen. Was that okay? Yes. Okay. I like to do a little bit of localization on my talks. That was it, by the way. From here on out, it's just English. But hi there. Web standards. They're a thing. Thank you. No. Someone's with me. Awesome. Rest of you, more coffee. Okay. So I've been doing this web thing for almost a quarter century now. In fact, later this year will be sort of the 25th anniversary of my first HTML document, which I marked up in Microsoft Word, because there were no HTML editors at the time. And if I didn't remember to save as text, the browser had no idea what to do with the result. But I'd like to look back for a moment to that era. In fact, I'd like to go back to the Big Bang of the web. This is the very first web page that was ever made. Sir Tim Berners-Lee put this up on the world's first web server on August 6th, 1991. And it still works today. It didn't look exactly like this at the time, I want to be clear. Because in those days, web pages did not default to a white background. The web looked more like this. Some of you may remember this firsthand. Others of you may have seen documentaries. But regardless, this is basically what the web looked like, right? It didn't have as many pixels, so all the text was blockier. And there was no way to give any presentation information whatsoever as an author. So that gray background, a sort of silvery light gray background, that's what every page had. The web was uniform in that way. And unless you were running NCSA Mosaic when it came out, because it had all these preferences where you, as the user, as the browser, could set all of those presentation things to be whatever you wanted. So you could make your H1s be tiny and lime green if you wanted. And I think all of us in that era did at some point, and then surfed around the web giggling. And then we changed it back because that was awful. So while this is primitive, maybe, it's still very recognizable. If I had taken away the Chrome and the top image and just shown you the text, you would have probably understood this for what it was. Now, in the time since, there have been some changes to the code. This is NCSA Mosaic attempting to display Wikipedia, which apparently has some embedded JavaScript, which Mosaic just shows as text. But you'll also notice that the rest of Wikipedia there, hyperlinks, it still works. But what's interesting to me is that a browser from 1991 might have some trouble with the web of 2018, but a web browser of 2018 has no trouble with the web of 1991. This is actually a capture that I got in Firefox Nightly yesterday. I took a high-resolution screenshot. This page is still online. It still loads responsibly and responsively in the latest web browsers, almost 30 years later. That is remarkable. Think about that. How much code written 3 decades ago can still be run anywhere? If you could dig up the 5.25-inch floppies from your Commodore 64 or the 3.5 inches from your Commodore Amiga, and you could get the data off of those media onto some computer, if you could get those files over, how much of it would still run? Web standards make that possible, make possible the fact that the first ever web page will still load and function just fine in my copy of Firefox Nightly on my computer that wasn't even designed until literal decades after this page was created. Standards underpin everything we do on the web. You know that, I know that, but it's worth considering, it's worth thinking about, and it's worth thinking about what grows out of that. I mean, there's been a shift over the last quarter century or so, as we saw with the Wikipedia example, in what we can do. There's been a lot of expansion in features. And there are a lot of factors at play. Douglas Crockford has this well-known dictum Although apparently he later amended it to say that he only thought that the web was the most hostile environment imaginable, but then he found out about mobile programming. But I think this is looking at things from somewhat the wrong angle. I have my own take on this. We have no idea what browsers, what media environments our work will be subjected to. We can't even say that today, never mind next year or 2 years or 5 years from now, right? And the more we assume, the less good our work can be. And that's just as true for browser developers and specification authors, right? We could look at this and think, oh, I know how I would turn that into a web page, right? A block quote in something, actually. Maybe you know exactly what you would do for the attribution line. I'm never sure. I would love it if there were an element for that, and maybe one day there will be. But for now, a block quote in something else. And speaking of block quotes, have you ever inspected a block quote with the user agent styles enabled in your inspector? Because if you have, you may have seen a few things that made the eye twitch a little, right? Like the indentation on the sides of the block quote is exactly 40 pixels, which is a little odd. The top and bottom margins are set to 1em, so they're based on the text size. That makes sense. But the sides are in pixels. And why is that? Because that's what Mosaic did. There is no other answer there. That's what Mosaic did. So, and I love this little block here of text, of styles, because you have these properties that some people in the audience probably have never heard of, maybe most of you, and are thinking, what does that do? Margin block start? Margin inline end? Like you can probably guess from their names what they do, but you have these properties that we don't use, but Firefox clearly does, and then you have these values that are almost 3 decades old. And this isn't the only example of this, I have to say. I went back into a previous version of Firefox. Back in the day, Firefox's html.css was a file that you could edit, right? So you could sort of do that Mosaic thing of, I'm going to make all the H1s be tiny, right, if you wanted to. This used to be in html.css. It's one rule, and it's just so that any unordered list that's 3 or more levels nested deep in a set of lists uses list style type square. That's, again, one rule. Somebody had to figure out all those combinations and then type them in. Now, Firefox doesn't do that anymore. Mozilla, the people at Mozilla actually came up with an any combinator thing, I'm not even sure what to call it, where you could say any of these and then any of these and then a UL list style type square. Like this never got exposed to the rest of us, so far as I know, and even if it did, only Mozilla would do it, but there it is. And I would love for this to be standardized. I can think of many cases where I would like to say any of these 3 things, like I could say :any, H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, H6, then close that in, span or M or whatever. That would be awesome. But they invented a thing just to make this rule shorter and probably much more performant. Because in mythology, Atlas carried the heavens on his back. On the web, the browsers that are Atlas carry history on their back. And it's not just history. It's also all the interactions of everything that there is now and everything that will come. And I'd like to illustrate that by considering the humble rounded border, rounded corner, excuse me. And for years, you may remember, the only way to get rounded corners on an element was to make it an image. And you just rounded the corners in the image, and it was baked in, and the text was an image. And then there was a time when you could construct it out of a hack using extra elements and maybe generated content and some CSS image sprites. And at one point, it was a 9-cell table with spacer GIFs and corner GIFs and background colors. But now it's so easy, right? One property, and you just so smooth, so simple. So why did it take so long for us to get that in browsers? We've had it for a while now. It's easy to forget that there were entire classes of CSS and HTML hacks that were devised just to create an effect like this that would, scale with the content and do the CSS stuff that we rely on. So there are a lot of things to consider when it comes to something like this. So I have 4 examples of ways that you could round a corner. In the first one, well, they're all the same value, but in the first one, you can see on the inside of the border, there's no curving. It's a square, and then there's a rounding. Number 2, there's a tiny little bit of rounding. Number 3, there's a bit more rounding, and number 4, there's even more rounding. And if you were to look at these, just from what I've shown you, do you know which of these is correct according to the specification? And then the more interesting question, do you know which one you want to be correct? So it turns out number 1 is what should happen because of the scope of the rounding. But here's another example. I've hugely rounded a corner, right? This is a small element that's, 30M by 30M, let's say. I just made up those numbers. And a corner rounding of 50M or something. So in this case, there are 2 possibilities of what should happen to the content. Let's vote. In fact, let's vote twice. So first, which of these do you like better, number 1 or number 2? Okay, we all like number 2. So now the more interesting question. Which one do you think is correct according to the specification, number 1 or number 2? Yeah, you all know. You know what's up. It's the first one. But let's take that result and consider a slightly different case. So in number 1, there's a small curve, and that's awesome. Right? We've got a image in the background there. But numbers 2 and 3 show a much more rounded corner. And the question is, what should happen to the content area there? Should it stay square as in number 2, or should it curve as in number 3? Now remember, in the previous slide, we all wanted it to curve. Right? We wanted the content to go along with the corner, but it didn't. So, here, think about what you think is correct or what you know to be correct from experience, but also what you want to see happen. So let's do it again. Which one would you prefer that this be, number 2 or number 3? Okay, and which one do you think is correct, number 2 or number 3? It's number 3. Which is awesome, but also conflicts with the previous slide. Because with the content, it didn't follow the curve, but somehow the background does. I hear muttering. Wait a minute. And when you mix background images into things, you start to have a really good time. So these days, it's possible to clip the background to various boxes. You can clip it to the content box, the padding box, or the border box. And in number 1, for example, I've clipped the background to the content box. Okay? And then number 2, I clipped it to the padding box. And in numbers 3 and 4, I have 2 different ways of clipping it to the border box. And you might be thinking, wait a minute, number 2 and number 3 are the same, dude. But they're not, as we can see by changing the border style. So, number 1, content box. Number 2, padding box. Number 3, border box. And number 4, other border box. So, you've probably all guessed that it's number 3 by now. But aha, guess what? You're right, it's number 3. Okay? Sanity 1 here. But intuitive sanity, not necessarily other kinds of sanity. And again, this conflicts with the whole thing with the content not curving or even clipping necessarily. I mean, we could make the content clip with overflow hidden, probably, but we don't have to say that for this to happen. But let's consider background image spacing with different origins. right? So background repeat space. Anyone done that, by the way? Background repeat space? Okay, I see we need more of a sense of adventure. So background repeat space lets you have the background images repeat, but they exactly come to the edges of whatever that background area is, and they distribute space between them. Sort of like Flexbox, not exactly. I don't want you to think that it's a precise one-to-one, but it's the same kind of idea. So, number one is a background repeat space with a background origin of content box, which means that there's the upper right corner of the repeat. It continues onwards, because that's what repeating backgrounds do. It keeps going, but that's sort of the point at which the repeating has to stop. And then, that the spacing has to stop, not the repeating. Okay, so in number 2 and 3, these are two different ways of handling the spacing if the background origin is padding box. One is inside that curve, and the other one is outside that curve where it looks like we should be able to see it, but it actually is just touching like where that curve is. And then in numbers 4 and 5, we have background repeat space, with the border box being the background origin, which is what we're used to. That's, at least it's what we think we're used to. But you can either have it be right there along the edge, or you can have it be sort of out in invisible space where the background would go if it hadn't been for the fact that we curved the border. Now, if you remember in the previous slide, when we curved the border, we got this effect where you can't see the background images out there. So, how many people, I'm just going to say, do you think that the repeat should go to number 4, the visible part, or number 5, where you actually can't see the background? Okay, so clearly I have overwhelmed you all. Nobody wants to vote anymore. Would it help if I had everyone close their eyes so we don't feel any sense of shame? It's okay if you don't know the answers here, right? As it turns out, numbers 3 and 5 are correct. So we can't see the background outside where the border is curved, and yet the placement of things depends on the stuff that we can't see, right? So with that in mind, it's probably pretty easy to work out what should happen with box shadow, right? Or is it? Because box shadow is actually defined to only exist outside the border box. We can look at these and think to ourselves, oh, well, the shadow is behind the element, right? But if you make everything transparent, one of these is actually the correct rendering. The other two I faked. Okay? Number 1 is actually a perfect example of an element with an unrounded corner. Right, so if I don't round any of the corners, if I just stick with the box, that's what the box shadow would look like for number 1 if I make the background and the borders transparent. Right, what you're seeing, that white there, is the slide background showing through where the element's content should be. It's not a white fill. Okay, so back to the borders and backgrounds. Let's vote again. Which one, and you get 3 choices this time, and this time I really just put up your hand, it doesn't matter. There's no judgment here. Well, not much, but okay. So, what should a box shadow do in this case? Number 1, number 2, number 3. Okay, so most of you think number 3. That's correct. But what about inset shadows? Do they all sit inside the padding area like in number 1? Do they follow the border like number 2 and 3? And if they do follow the border, should it follow the inner border edge or the outer border edge? That's the difference between 2 and 3. You've got that as opposed to the wider curve. So, number 1, number 2, number 3. And now I'm going to change it again to ask which one you want it to be. Number 1, number 2, number 3. Does anybody want number 3? Okay, cool. It's actually number 3. I'm sad about that. I wanted it to be number 2. I really did. And the way that I made this work is I had to add extra offsets to get the inset where it should go. Oh well. Because the truth is, something as simple as a change of border width can bring up some very interesting question. I'm not going to ask you to vote on this. I'm going to assume that we all generally prefer 1 to 2. I mean, there are cases where number 2 might be kind of fun, but in general, like by default, we would prefer number 1. And that is, in fact, what the specification calls for, which is a little bit interesting when you think about it, because other things like changes of border style or border color are not smoothly interpolated. There's this very abrupt discontinuity. And that's a holdover from back when all corners were square, then it made sense, right? They were like the sides of a wooden picture frame. And if you have a grooved border, that's border style groove, then everything's lighted, quote unquote, right? As if there were a light source in the upper left, and then each bit of that border is highlighted or shaded according to how that would look. So it's supposed to look like it's been carved into the page. And the same thing with the red and blue grooved border. And then on the end there with the solid colors, it's just blue, red. But now we're curving them. The metaphor breaks down, right? The artifice is revealed. The ones in the middle there, the ones that are supposed to be grooved borders, they don't look like that anymore. It might be an interesting look, but they don't look like grooves. So in those cases, maybe it would be nice if there were a gradual transition, right? Some sort of gradient style thing. Looks better. It's possibly not the best way to represent a grooved, curved border, but it's what I could hack together in 5 minutes. And the red-blue groove is, I think, also improved upon, but there are a lot of questions here, right, about angles and transitions and lighting sources and, what if I don't want my lighting source to come from the top left, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? But we'll go with this for the moment. Suppose for a moment that we could get the working group to take up gradient smoothed corners. So let's consider the simplest case, which is this one. Number 1 is I didn't smooth anything, right? This is what browsers do now. Numbers 2 through 4 show just 3 possible approaches to smoothing out the gradient here. 3 and 4 might look the same right now. Let me do them in grayscale to see if you can sort of see there's a little bit more of the light goes a little bit further, the light part of it. Anyway, I'm going to bring it back. So number 2, the transition is spread out kind of along the entire curve. Maybe goes a little bit past it, but along the entire curve. Numbers 3 and 4, it's a shorter transition with just different weighting of what goes where. So I'm going to ask what you like. Who likes number 2? Number 3? Number 4? Right. Thing is, none of you are wrong. These are matters of taste in a lot of cases. But things can't stay that simple, because border widths do change, right? This is a thing we can do now, except only one of these things is what browsers actually do. So number 1 is like a 45-degree transition line. Number 2 is, 60 degrees or something. And number 3 is whatever, 85-degree transition, something where it's almost all blue until it becomes a little bit of red. So, do you know which of these is the real browser transition between 2 differently colored border widths? Number 1, anyone? Number 2? Number 3? It's number 3. And I can tell you why. I can show you why. It worked out like this. So suppose that we didn't round that corner. This is what the corner would look like of those 2 borders. And if you take that and you extend it out into a huge box, so it keeps going on the same slope, that's where the curve intercepts that slope. That's how it ends up like that. Makes total sense, but probably isn't what we would want if we were to design it visually. So, which gradient would be best in this situation, number 2 or number 3? Do we have the gradient go across the entire span of the curve, or do we weight it so that the blue goes mostly down to where the transition would be without the smoothing. I'm not going to make you vote on these, by the way. I think you've done enough for now. Right? Should we give authors control over this? Should we smooth the transition between these? Maybe. I can certainly see that being a request. You know, not everybody wants to see that from one color to another. But the thing is, right now, if I don't want to see that, if I want something more like number 2 or number 3, I have to nest a couple of elements and use like background linear gradient hacks and all kinds of shenanigans in order to make this happen. So I could see if this becomes, you know, if Web 4.0 is this visual style, right? That the working group takes it up. It's like lots of people are doing this, and they're littering up their DOM trees and their markup and everything else to make it happen, so we may as well give them a way to do it. It's not that computationally difficult to figure out, but it's human computationally difficult to figure out what we should tell the computers to do. That's a lot of the challenge, right? But if we're going to give authors the ability to control this, how's that going to work? Right? What property could we define to do this? And would you have to do it on a per corner basis, or would one value apply to all of them? And is there different weighting? Like, how do you say that you want the midpoint to be here or here, or whatever you're going to do? How's that going to go? And it gets worse, because image borders are a thing now. Anyone used image borders? Yeah, we need a lot more adventure. So with image borders, you take a single image and you can define slicing offsets. You don't have to understand based on me describing it, because I barely understand it myself, and I'm the one trying to describe it. But you'd like define offsets so that your single image gets sliced up into a bunch of different pieces, and then they're used to decorate the border. So what should happen if I curve a border corner that has images? Do I do rectangular to polar transformation? Do I use some other kind of deformation approach? Right now, browsers take what I can see as a sensible approach. They just don't let you around the corner, right? If you do this and you do this, the answer here is that plus that equals that, right? But should that be the case? Like, should that always be the case? Or should we allow authors, do authors want to curve images, like, you know, stars along that corner, that curved corner? And if so, how's that supposed to work? But wait, it gets worse, because the working group is even now considering a proposal to allow corner-separated multiple borders on a single element. The way that we do, like, comma-separated backgrounds now, right? So you could say, you know, border, comma, border for your div or your section or your pre or whatever, and get a result like that. So how should browsers handle multiple borders along a single corner? We could make arguments about how it should be as if we had nested 3 elements and then curved each one the exact amount to make them meet and not have gaps between them or overlap, which is how you would have to do it now. Okay, but there are other possibilities here. And even if you make that argument, then you have to worry about all of the stuff that we saw before, changes of border width and style and color, right? Which I didn't even try to get to here. But hold on a second, it gets even worse, because the working group is also considering allowing you to do this, where you have scooped out corners. How's that going to work? Like, you go and then you have to turn 90 degrees, or maybe not 90 degrees, it depends on the curvature, and then there's got to be a transition in here somewhere, and then you've got another. But, like, could we just have it be at one of the rounds, or maybe... But wait! What if an image border gets in there? I have no answers for you. But just think about it. All that from the humble, rounded corner. And those are just some of the potential interactions with existing CSS, not to mention the entire history of web layout, that browsers had, and browser makers and specification authors had to think about in order to make this possible. And we still have unresolved questions about the most basic of web things that make it difficult to answer some of these questions. Consider this drop-down control. Select padding 1em. Where does the padding go? Option margin, 1/2em. What should happen, if anything, right? Nobody knows. Nobody can tell you, because there is no answer there. There literally may not be an answer, but at the moment, specification-wise, there is no answer, okay? So a drop-down like this is technically a replaced element. It's like an image in that sense, right? So if I say to you, where should the padding go on an image, there's actually an answer to that. It's a kind of, sometimes it seems like a non-answer, but there's an answer to that. But this control is technically a replaced element. None of us should be able to style its interior at all. It should be untouchable. And yet, if I change the font size on this is a direct browser capture. I got it by setting the font size to 40 VH, viewport height units, which seems completely ludicrous in a desktop setting. But in mobile, that might actually make sense, except for the result, right? And here's another question. Some of you may be familiar with display contents. What happens if I apply display contents to a select element? Because with display contents, it's supposed to take the element that you applied it to and sort of remove it. Not exactly, but it's supposed to be not used for visual purposes, and all of its children are supposed to be elevated so that if I have a form with a select and an option and I set display contents to the select, then all the options should behave as if they're children of the form in terms of CSS. What would that do? I don't know. Nobody knows. And don't do that, by the way. And actually don't use display contents right now, because it turns out that there's a bug in browsers where if you set display contents on an element, it takes that element out of the rendering tree, but it takes that element and all of its children out of the accessibility tree. So don't do that. It's a bug. It will likely be fixed very soon. So you can keep an eye on that. If display contents has you on fire, that's the solution you've been looking for a thing that you're doing. You just need to wait until you've heard that bug's been resolved. Okay. So you can see why something like inventing and deploying an entire new layout system might take a while. Grid, layout. We've been saying for 20 years that there's a layout-shaped hole in the middle of CSS. Now that hole's been filled. Flexbox and Grid, 98% fill that hole at the moment. But for 20 years, 25 years actually, people have been saying, CSS is a great presentational language, but a layout language it is not. Right? Now it actually has claimed to be a layout language, but it took forever to get to that point. Now, I'm not going to say that the working group was working on a grid system for that entire time, because they weren't. Right? For a long time, a lot of people in the working group had the attitude of, this is not what we're here for. Layout, no, we're here for presentation. Strange but true. That shifted, and it actually shifted in part because Internet Explorer 10 shipped a grid implementation. They had a proposal, and they said, here it is, it works. You use vendor prefixes, remember those? And there was a grid implementation, and then it took 5.5 years to work out what the actual specification should be. I mean, putting things on a grid might seem simple, although how might rounded corners interact with grid layout? Probably not at all, but then again, maybe. I'm not sure. No one's sure. SubGrid may not be so simple because of how things have to relate to each other. So the idea with SubGrid is that, sort of like I was describing display contents, a grid item's children can participate in the outer grid. So in that tomato area, I might have that's a grid item, and I might have one of its children set so I want it to be in the 4th column track of the outer grid and the 3rd row track, and I want it to participate in that grid. Like I want it to size according to what happens to the outer grid, and I want the outer grid to be resized according to what's in that subgridded item, okay? So you've got grid items that participate in the sizing of a grid, and then children of some of those grid items may also be participating in the sizing of that grid. That's, wow, right? Like, I can think of solutions to that, but I don't have to, like, implement them, so easy for me to say. And we could look to display contents for answers, but remember, we just found out display contents has issues of its own. And this sort of complexity applies to every new piece of CSS or styling. It applies to web typography and things like variable fonts. It applies to the technologies that we're going to use to make design so much better than it's been before on the web. Certainly it applies to SVG and filters, to container queries. You know, box alignment went through a long period of trying to figure out how it should work and literally what the property names should be. And that's still ongoing as box alignment tries to make its way out of Flexbox and Grid and be available everywhere. Even writing CSS at scale for inclusion, there are a lot of things that have to be considered, and especially things like merging CSS and JavaScript, right? Is Houdini the answer here? Are we just gonna like write our own solutions? Well, and if so, what are the failure states there? What are the risks? Will the working group and the browser makers just like give up on advancing CSS and leave it all to us to write our own little plugins to browsers? So today you're going to hear from people talking about incredible technologies, things we've wanted to do for years, in some cases literally decades, and those are only possible, those are only things for us to talk about because of all of the work done in the CSS working group, at the browser implementers, and by the community to overcome the friction that I've talked about here. So the question is, how can we, as members of the community, help push new features past this friction and into a glorious space-filled future? So I have a few recommendations. 1, experiment. Play, go crazy, be adventurous. Not necessarily for deployment, but just mess with stuff and see what happens, right? Take your site and like spawn a copy of the homepage and rework it so the whole thing's in Flexbox. And see if it works, or see if you keep running into bugs, because maybe you will have discovered an interaction that nobody ever thought of, because you happen to put together 4 properties that each considered on their own make total sense, but when you put them together, kaboom. That's actually good. Like, the working group needs to know those things, right? Take, the homepage of the BBC and see if you can like do it with only with box alignment and not use Grid or Flexbox. Whatever, right? Like, just put stuff together. Do your own art project, right? See if you can get close to what Nadi was talking about yesterday, right? Except you're, doing it without the benefit of SVG. Because this is how these things are found, right? Bug reports come from, hey, I took this thing and I tried to put it in here and it didn't work. Now, in order to do this, you need to make sure you've enabled experimental features. Chrome makes this pretty easy. If you go into Chrome://flags, experimental web platform features, enabled, boom. This is the replacement for vendor prefixes. Back in the day, we had vendor prefixed properties that we could like experiment with, but then people would just deploy them. Here, you turn on a flag in the browser, and then you get access to all the stuff in not prefixed form, knowing that it can change, but the general public releases, that flag is never enabled. So you can't deploy, basically. Firefox doesn't make this nearly as easy. They have this massive list of flags. I mean, it's very fine-grained control, which is nice in its own way. But if you want to do something, you have to search for it. So if you need to turn on a Flexbox thing, you have to search for Flexbox, and then devtools.layout.flexbox.open. Maybe I want that to be false, or maybe I need to turn things on to true. Can be a little bit confusing at times. You have to know what you're looking for, but it's still worth doing. One of the nice things about it is that if you're like super interested in Grid, you can search for Grid and see if there are any flags you don't recognize, and then go looking for, hey, what's this do? Maybe I should turn that on. And another place where things get worked out is in preprocessors, like less or SAS or post-CSS. Things that make it easier for us to write our own CSS. So this is gradient easing. Don't worry, voting's over. No more voting. But number one there is a linear gradient. And a linear gradient doesn't just mean goes in a line. It also means goes linearly from color stop to color stop. There's a linear easing. So this is going from opaque black to completely transparent black linearly. If this is 100 pixels tall, then each pixel will be 1% more transparent. Number two is more of a easing out of that by using a feature in browsers to set the midpoint to differently than 50%. So I can say, linear gradient to bottom, black, comma, 33%, comma, transparent. And so the midpoint of the transition will actually be at the 33% of the way along the line. So it goes from opaque black to 50% transparent black at the 33% point on the line, and then the remaining 67%, it goes from half transparent to fully transparent. So that's number two. Number three, Andreas Larsen wrote a post-CSS plugin where he can basically he set it up so you can say, okay, I want to transition from black to transparent, but I want to do it with ease in out, like timing, quote unquote, like so that it eases into the black and then it quickly goes from black to mostly opaque to mostly transparent, and then it eases out. And it does that by creating like 11 linear color stops, because at the moment it's difficult to do anything else in browsers. This has become a proposal in CSS to add timing functions like ease in or cubic Bezier to gradients, and it's quite likely to move forward. And then there's Houdini, right, as I intimated. Houdini may be the answer. So it may be a while before we can really use it, but in an anything goes future, who's going to think through all these interactions that I've been talking about, and what happens when people inevitably don't? Because any complex system will experience friction. Any complex system with a history will be suffused with friction, but friction's not a bug. It's an emergent property of a complex system. And it's especially a feature of a system that's being extended with intelligence and care, with an awareness of how easy it is to break things by mistake. And in that case, what we see as friction is more properly understood as responsibility. Because the future is coming, whether we want it or not, and the shape that future takes is up to us, possibly more than ever before. And so in our rush to create the new, please remember the old. Because we have a responsibility not to break the chain of compatibility that has made the web one of the most robust and resilient mediums the world has ever known. Please always take that responsibility seriously. Dank u wel.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you.
Come over to our
Yes.
chairs here. I think we've got time for,
I will follow you.
for a quick question.
Sorry, I ran a little long.
That's okay. So we're just switching over speakers. I think Twitter was very excited about background repeat space. That's we saw that a lot. I think listening to the talk, I mean, obviously, I'm very excited about the very minor details of CSS specifications and kind of have to be. But do you think there's a benefit to the average web developer actually understanding this stuff?
I think yes, in the sense that it can help us be more patient with browsers, with the working group, because there's always there's that thing of, oh, I just saw this proposal that a browser will let me say that I want that same red that I had before, but 30% later. Why can't I have it now?
Yeah.
Right? What's wrong with that? That would be so simple. What's wrong with you? Which reminds me a little bit of the people, on Hacker News who are like, Twitter, I could implement that in a weekend, right?
Yes.
But once to understand what goes into it, I don't demand that everyone follow the minutia of every, debate, but just understand that there's a lot at play. There's way more than it looks like.
Yeah.
And so that there's that. This is why it takes a while for these things to ship.
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes say that spec development is a bit like, working on any product, except that the users, it's absolutely everyone who touches the web, which makes it incredibly complicated.
Yeah.
But yeah, I thank you very much for sharing a bit about what goes into doing this. I think it's been fascinating for people, and it's great to share a stage with you.
Awesome. Thanks.
Take care.
Thank you.